Good. All signed and sealed. Now, let's begin the transfusion. Oh, don't you worry. Whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad dream.
John Carpenter's The Thing is what many people consider the closest we'll ever get to a proper Hollywood film that takes after the works of H.P. Lovecraft. The film follows the crew of an Antarctic research station being terrorized by an alien entity that can perfectly mimic humans. It is a story of survival as the staff relentlessly try to weed out who is human and who isn't, while the titular thing tries to stay hidden and make its next kill. By the end of the film, it's unclear who is predator and who is prey, as the line between man and monster is blurred into an inky soup. As great a film Carpenter made, it is by no means truly Lovecraftian. The origin and nature of the creature isn't exactly a mystery to the audience, and depending on which theory you subscribe to regarding the film's ending, there's a decent chance humanity may have a chance to win. Lovecraft himself was an extreme xenophobe and unapologetically racist, even for the standards of the early 1900s. But nevertheless, it is impossible to deny the effect he's had on modern fiction and popular culture. The legacy of his mythos can be felt everywhere, from Gary Gygax to Stephen King, H.R. Geiger, and of course our friend John Carpenter. The idea of humanity's insignificance at the hands of exceedingly alien and incomprehensible beings far above us in terms of intelligence is a goldmine for horror, fantasy, and science fiction alike. Unfortunately, the underlying vagueness and incomprehensibility of Lovecraft's creations have typically made his works effectively unadaptable, the only moderately successful film to directly adapt one of Lovecraft's works being Reanimator. And as fun of a film that is, it's not what you typically consider Lovecraft.
You'll never get credit for my discovery. Who's going to believe a talking head? Get a job in a sideshow.
Apart from a few winks, nods, and locations, it draws little from the most beloved works in his catalog, such as Mountains of Madness, Dunwich Horror, Call of Cthulhu, and my personal favorite, The Shadow over Innsmouth. The legacy of these works is not only what made Lovecraft, but also what makes him so hard to sell to mainstream audiences. These novellas require a sense of dread, timing, and deliberateness, and an ability to give away just enough through description, but still leave some to the imagination. There's a degree of audience investment to make connections and conclusions yourself, something only the vivid description provided by literary media can really provide. Thankfully for us, there exists a medium where a Lovecraft adaptation could truly thrive. And in my opinion, that is video games. From Software first showed off Bloodborne under the codename of Project Beast. It promised a new kind of experience that drew on the previous games in their critically acclaimed Souls series, set in a sprawling fictional city that took the form of Gothic London, overrun by a lycanthropic plague. The trailer's setting and score made it a hit with audiences almost immediately, roping them in until release day, only to realize something far fouler than beasts were stalking the streets of Yharnam. Like The Thing, Bloodborne is about the line between predator and prey being blurred as man and beast become indistinguishable under the pale light of the moon. But everything from its setting to its slow burn is more Lovecraft than Carpenter ever came. And there's no MacReady to cheer for, and no hope of escape. So what exactly kind of stark raving mad game did the dev team at From Software cook up? Well, today we're here to examine exactly that. Burn some beast-repelling incense, and lock your door tight, as I recount to you, dear viewer, my love letter to Bloodborne. I think the first thing that jumps out to me about Bloodborne's story is how it seamlessly transitions from gothic horror to cosmic horror. From the first moments of the game, as the messengers crawl atop your character, there's this prevailing sense of something being altogether off about Yharnam. I love the way it makes you second-guess this aspect of it, and one brilliant example is Yusefka, an NPC you meet after dying and respawning in Yharnam.
I know that you hunt for us, for our town, but I'm sorry. Please. This is all that I can do. Now, go.
She'll give you her blood vial, one that heals for nearly double the health of a standard blood vial. A treasure to be sure, but go back to grab one another after, say, spending it to kill Father Gascoigne, and Yusefka has changed ever so slightly.
Oh, well, hello. Splendid. Let me ask you a small kindness. You're soon off to hunt, I presume? Then, if you find any survivors, tell them to seek Yusefka's clinic. Upon my Hippocratic oath, if they are yet human, I will look after them. Perhaps even cure them.
You begin to wonder if it's just your mind playing tricks on you. What made her change her mind about letting people into the clinic? Well, when you get your answer later in the game, it could be considered a tad maddening. This is but one anecdote of the spiraling madness of a story Bloodborne tells. By tracing everything that has led up to your descent into the Moonside Lake to find the truth, you begin to piece together a story of hubris and playing God, with a twisted architect of a fallen prophet whose miracle cure instead unleashed a plague that consumed even himself. I of course speak of Lawrence, the cleric beast, wreathed in flames and left to sulk in the nightmare. I think it speaks volumes to the world of Bloodborne that the person who built the Healing Church, an organization that toppled the rule of the Canehurst nobles, doesn't so much as speak when we meet him. He's immolated, cursed to burn for his sins, like how he burned the legacy of Gurmanen, Old Yarnum, and every last beast slain by his decree. I think Lawrence is testament to Bloodborne's story as a whole. We often forget, throughout our journey, that every beast we lay waste to was in fact once human. In fact, Dejura and Gascoigne know all too well. Lawrence's actions warp the history of Yarnum. Every character, every event can be traced back to something he did, a choice he made or an order he gave. The words he gave to Willem were empty. He surely didn't forget the motto, but he certainly forgot what it meant.
We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Our eyes are yet to open.
Fear the old blood. I must take my leave.
What makes Lawrence such a poignant figure in Bloodborne's story is his ubiquity within it. He gives us a clear through line through which to trace Bloodborne's events. Like Dark Souls before it, Bloodborne relies heavily on a form of indirect storytelling relying on item descriptions, setting design, and just enough context through dialogue that the average player can make some semblance of a sense of what's going on. Unlike Dark Souls, however, the beauty of Bloodborne's narrative is that it trades scale for detail. The story of Dark Souls 1 has 5 distinct ages in the world. The Age of Dragons, the Rise of Lords, the Age of Fire, the Fading Lords, the Linking of the Fire, and finally the Second Fade. Your character begins at the very tail end of the first flame fading for a second time. Assuming each age lasted approximately 1,000 years, and each transitional period was about a century, the inciting event of Dark Souls' narrative occurred almost 3 millennia before the machinations of the universe sent you, the chosen undead, on a path to the kiln of the first flame. Lawrence, however, is not a distant memory. Human characters with human lifespans speak of him. Gurman knew him personally. Everything that has led to where your hunter ends up has been only some 50 years or so in the making, if that. While the memories of the powder kegs, Lawrence, and the Tomb of the Gods are still quite fresh in the minds of any hunter worth their blood. By condensing the lore this much, it makes it feel far more important. We're feeling the direct effects of actions that aren't distant legends, but instead the fallout of events that still send shockwaves into society today. For a fictional world like Bloodborne, it means we've avoided something called a time abyss. A time abyss can occur often in fantasy and science fiction. With so many kingdoms lost to time, it's easy to get caught up in a proverbial tiramisu of lore. While far from the world of Bloodborne, I think one of my favorite examples of a time abyss comes from The Matrix. Following Neo's freedom from the Matrix, he's given some exposition from Morpheus that sums up the machine's rise to power and the current state of things in the real world. And nobody really cares. The machines taking over the surface world is at worst a plot device for part of the film's climax, and at best bait for the sequels. While a time abyss makes for an effective reveal in the moment, you the audience soon realize that the struggle the crew the Nebuchadnezzar is undertaking is but an echo of a much grander conflict. Any punch it has dwindles as the sheer distance and vagueness of the past conflict is lost, obscured by the abyss of time. A time abyss can be detrimental to a story for this reason. Lore reveals like this lack impact because in many ways it's irrelevant to the task at hand. The machine takeover has already happened. Earth is beyond saving. The world the Matrix creates is part of an illusion, taken from a legacy ripped from history. That empire has fallen.
Like the dinosaur. Look out that window. You had your time.
A primary reason Anor Londo is one of the best moments in the original Dark Souls is how it avoids a time abyss. The city is presented to us in all its glory, its scale monumental. It reminds players what linking the fire will preserve, only to dash that expectation if you destroy the illusion of Guinevere, an illusion that obscures the city's state, an illusion that obscures a time abyss, because so too has Anor Londo been obscured by darkness. Their empire has fallen. But Yharnam still has folks with their wits about them. It's still a functioning city, for the most part. There's dry docks, a clinic, people partying, industry, families, and a hope, as described in the Shining Coins item text, that morning will eventually come, and everything will be back to normal. But the cracks are forming. The Snatchers from Yahar Ghul roam the back alleys, the Hunt consumes entire neighborhoods, and has already left Old Yharnam a decrepit, uninhabitable, waking nightmare. The church has locked themselves in. The last vicar remains in prayer, only to die by the hands of a wayward hunter. The Godhead watches from its precarious perch, waiting for the moon to come out, and the fires of the Hunt to burn away what's left. We don't experience the remnants of a fallen empire in Bloodborne. In Bloodborne, we observe the dying breath of one about to hit rock bottom. Bloodborne is able to avoid a time abyss throughout most of the main game by keeping the action centered on Lawrence and his inner circle, with one exception, that being the Temerians of the Chalice Dungeons, but we'll discuss those a little later on. For now, though, I would like to draw attention to some specific examples from the lore of Bloodborne and how they each represent the nature of Yharnam, the themes of Bloodborne, and the story's lack of a time abyss, and the storytelling techniques the game is able to utilize. I already made it very clear that Lawrence is in many ways the progenitor of every bad thing to ever befall Yharnam as we observe it. In many ways it makes him the protagonist, at least in terms of a traditional Lovecraftian narrative, such as Call of Cthulhu, arguably Lovecraft's most famous piece. It's structured in a series of isolated stories of people who came in contact with the titular Great Old One, and as each story comes to light, is compiled and retold to us by our protagonist, the only other conjoining thread apart from Cthulhu himself. In many ways, Lawrence fills that role for Bloodborne. The web he's weaved has ensnared the lives of many, and each act of Bloodborne follows a particular part of that web, Yharnam representing the present, the result of Lawrence's actions, and once dusk ends, the world state changes. We shift to the past and learn of Byrgenwerth, the place where Lawrence's ambition was born, and finally the third act touches on how Lawrence's legacy will affect those who carry it on, the future of Yharnam's fallen empire. Throughout these three acts, we meet characters who embody the microcosm of each conflict within the lore of Bloodborne. I want to dwell on one I feel best represents Bloodborne's ability to weave its story through its gameplay. As Lawrence wedged more and more power from his miraculous blood healing, the vile bloods of Cainhurst, the old royalty of Yharnam, had been more or less ousted by the healing church politically. With heretical, unsanctioned blood given to them by a former colleague of Byrgenwerth, it was only a matter of time before the first vicar ordered their removal.
I am Annalise, Queen of Castle Cainhurst. Ruler of the Vile Bloods, and sworn enemy of the Church. Yet our people are murdered, and we are prisoner to this wretched mask. What is it thou art in search of?
The church sent Ligarius, its head executioner, to dispose of the Vile Blood menace and slay Queen Annalise. Only the corruption of the Vile Bloods was too great. Ligarius failed to slay the queen, and the executioners fled, save Ligarius himself, who remained in a last-ditch effort to seal away the corruption of the Vile Bloods. What makes this story hit so hard is the ascent up Cainhurst Castle itself. The portcullis opens up to a collapsed courtyard with creatures that have starved of fresh meat. as you begin to realize just how long the old nobility has been kept away from Yharnam. The castle is untouched and ghostly cold. Apparitions of maidens bound at the wrist stalk you through the empty halls as you begin to realize how many people were killed in the massacre. Outside the library, you find both the garb of the executioners and the Cainhurst Knights, keying you into that a great battle was fought here. When you are branded with the mark of the Vilebloods for trespassing, the apparitions that have been stalking you scream as blood erupts from their necks, the executioners having lived up to their names. When last you ascend to Ligaria's seat, the martyr rises from his slumber and summons the wrathful spirits of those damned by the fight between the factions. He does all in his power to slay you and prevent you from ever discovering the nature of his one final regret. The song that plays here during the fight is entitled The Vileblood Queen, and is in many ways the theme less of Ligarius and more of the greater evil he sealed behind him. The track isn't epic, its violin and creeping bass feels like the approach of something sinister, just out of reach, hidden and obscured by the snow. Upon felling Ligarius, you will be rewarded with his crown, the Crown of Illusions, a naming that is possibly one of my favorite moments in Bloodborne. As the crown of the old royalty, it represents rulership over Cainhurst, but its title of Crown of Illusions, well, at first seems only a mention to how it obscures the veil on the throne room. It's a much more subtle and tragic reference to the illusion Ligarius himself lived in. By taking up the crown, he began the illusion that Annalise was dead, the illusion that the executioners were in the right, the illusion that victory had occurred, and in Ligarius's illusion, he was the king of Castle Cainhurst. By taking up that same Crown of Illusions, we are given the chance to help Alfred, an executioner and one of the few sane people left in Yharnam.
Is that the sigil of Cainhurst? I've heard tell of Cainhurst nobles and their amusingly pompous invitations. Wonderful. I thank you profusely. I will depart immediately, but first, a token of my gratitude.
He is given the chance to enter Cainhurst himself and perpetuate that illusion just a little longer.
Master, look! I've done it! I've done it! I smashed and pounded and grounded this rotten siren into fleshy pink pulp. There, you filthy monstrosity! What good's your immortality now? Try stirring up trouble in this sorry state. All mangled and twisted, with every inside on the outside for all the world to see.
Or, we could do him the favor of shattering it.
Jealous, aren't you?
While I'd love to sit here and wax eloquent about the writing and lore, this video would become more of an incoherent mess than it already is. I feel like Cainhurst's blending of NPC quests with level design and self-contained narrative is the most emblematic thing about Bloodborne's wealth of player options. However, it doesn't speak to perhaps the most liberating and central aspect of Bloodborne's gameplay, and that is of course its rigid and masterfully designed combat system. My biggest fear with this video going in was that I'd feel like I was stepping on the heels of others who came before, say what has already been said, and risk looking like an unoriginal hack. Naturally, then, as I begin this segment, I could preface it by saying my ultimate thesis is that Bloodborne's combat system is amazing because you don't have a shield to hide behind, and if you like hiding behind shields, you're a terrible person who hates fun. Ultimately, though, I think I cannot begin that way, for I am not nearly British nor pretentious enough to make such a claim. In truth, Bloodborne's combat system has been picked apart by people before me and will certainly be continued to be dissected by people after me. And should I say something of value here, I can only hope it gets echoed later by other pseudo-intellectuals like myself looking to gush about a favorite game of theirs. Bloodborne's entire combat system revolves around a feedback loop designed in almost every way to make you play aggressively and take risks. Having me in at least 8 drafts of this script, I've come to realize that the best argument I came up with had to deal with Bloodborne's use of gameplay incentives to actively stimulate a response and build habits in its players. While this can be immediately ascribed to the lack of shields, there being only 2 in the entire game, I feel this is a complete disservice to the large amount of gameplay overhaul that occurred between Bloodborne and its predecessors. Let's look at those 2 shields for a moment. One does absolutely nothing and the other blocks arcane projectiles. And as funky as the lock shield is, there's a good chance most players will never give it a second look, simply because by that time, they've already had it ingrained in their heads that their resources are far better spent playing aggressively, offhanding a firearm for parrying. But how does that mindset even occur? Well, for that we need to go back to the beginning of the game. In the Hunter's Dream, you pick up 2 weapons, your choice of an axe, a saw, or a bladed cane, along with a precise pistol or a rowdier blunderbuss. As you play around with them, you begin to realize how little stamina your weapon strikes utilize. This seems at first alien to your average Dark Souls player, who's more used to weapons bigger than a dagger taking large chunks, close to whole quarters or thirds of your stamina bar at once, when this is in fact the biggest and most important change Bloodborne made to the weapon mechanics, the length of combos. A typical Dark Souls weapon has loads of startup frames for the first attack. You can't exactly spam because nothing ever happens immediately. Your character has to wind up, so to speak. Most weapons hit twice, sometimes 3 times for the lighter weapons before their animation has to reset, and you begin again with those nasty startup frames. This creates the gameplay loop that forces you into a more passive playstyle, as you need a longer opening to get your hits in, and therefore hiding behind a shield becomes a safer option when you wait for that opening to occur. Bloodborne, like with many things, takes cues from Dark Souls in this regard. However, it switches those startup frames instead for recovery frames at the end of a much longer combo string, often 4 to 5 hits for most weapons, with the heaviest weapons in the game still being able to go a full 3 hits before an animation reset. Having those 4 to 5 hits in a singular combo string is crucial, as it ties directly into the first mechanical payoff for aggressive play. Most big enemies and bosses in Bloodborne enter a stagger animation after about 5 to 6 hits. While stagger is a mainstay of hack and slash, Bloodborne takes an approach to stagger that is less in line with Souls and more in line with a traditional hack and slash. Namely, the stagger animation occurs at the same count as a full combo string. Oftentimes, one well-placed dodge and a full combo will get most enemies to stagger, allowing you to dispose of them by going all out and tearing them to pieces, not only thematically consistent with the lore, but also stupidly clever in how it changes the player's approach to an opening in combat. By going all in for the stagger, you are naturally both rewarded and encouraged to play aggressive, though this bears the question, if stagger is the reward, what is the risk? That question is often answered by a player getting greedy and going in for more damage. Consequently, that creates overextension and not being able to dodge out. And, of course, you get hit. In Dark Souls, after this happens, usually the answer is to disengage and heal with your Estus, but in Bloodborne there's a legitimate mechanical incentive to standing your ground and going back for the kill. I think the rally system, above everything else in regards to stamina regen and combo length, is why Bloodborne rewards aggressive play more than anything else. It seems simple, but something so little as a window to regenerate your health makes a world of difference in how you approach the game. It changes every hit you take into a split-second decision, with both options offering some kind of mechanical trade-off. Do you risk disengaging if it means a reliable large heal if it kills your momentum? Or do you keep that momentum but not heal as much, risking death if you make another mistake? By rewarding aggressive play with tangible mechanical benefits, the wait and bait strategy of Dark Souls becomes objectively suboptimal. By playing aggressively and effectively using the rally system, you lose fewer healing items and build damage quicker, and thus trigger more staggers. The rally system in this fashion does probably the best job of any mechanic in Bloodborne of preventing the mainstay of cheesy Souls play, turtling behind your shield. Turtling, however, is not the only passive way to play Souls, and while the rallying combo systems mechanically deter it, another prime cheese tactic that Bloodborne needed to address was Backstab Phishing. Backstabbing is simple in concept to understand, and in Dark Souls 1 it was arguably the most reliable and effective method of downing enemies. Basically, if you can figure out how to kite an enemy into a backstab loop, you are more or less guaranteed to win unless your ceiling collapses and your TV breaks or something. Bloodborne avoids this by making backstabs inherently situational, and really bringing them back to what they should be, an ambush tactic. This enemy here is a prime example. Facing away, I can charge an R2 and get my backstab, but considering how long that took to charge and how that's the only way to trigger one, being assaulted by a bunch of particularly aggressive enemies, or crowds of them, is a tactic that turns you into a sitting duck, and for a few seconds in an aggressive game like Bloodborne, that is a recipe for disaster. Remember that pistol you picked up earlier? Well, here's where it comes in handy. A regrettably common saying from Dark Souls fans is LMAO, just parry him bro. And while in Dark Souls that is certainly an option, shield parries are a bit obtuse and reasonably hard to get the hang of. And this has everything to do with the fact that I suck at video games. Oh, and also, the animations for shield parries are poorly designed and deliberately misleading. I think there is very much an argument to be made for how clunky the parry mechanics in Dark Souls are and how Bloodborne fixes them. As with anything, practice will make you good at the parry mechanics in Dark Souls, but that doesn't change whether or not the mechanic is well implemented. If you were just fooling around with the buttons, you'd figure out that the parry probably occurs here, as you move your shield away to swat the attack off. It seems simple. However, this isn't the case, as actually there is a push with the shield right at the beginning of the animation. This is the point where the parry in Dark Souls occurs. That swatting animation is actually the lengthy reset frames. Designing it in this way, I believe the parry feels deliberately anti-player and almost like false difficulty because of the misleading animation. Not only must you react to the enemy, you also need to pay attention to where the parry point of your shield is, something that varies between shields, and this timing can get very hard to get used to if you don't know this secret. Bloodborne conversely eliminates the need to focus on your own animation and instead puts the focus solely on timing against the enemy's attack. The standard shield animation is made up of 3 parts: the wind-up, the parry point, and the swat. Hitting during the swat or the wind-up will flub the parry and get you killed. Bloodborne's parry is instead a shot with your offhand weapon. It happens almost instantaneously, and the parry point and both the successful parry are accompanied by an audio cue. Unlike in Dark Souls, where the audio cue only occurs after a successful parry and not at the parry point. Bloodborne's parries are, by comparison, so much more fluid and intuitive. Switching the parry from proactive to reactive takes away the deliberateness and clockwork combat of Dark Souls once again, and leans more into that aggressive reactive playstyle. With a legitimate mechanical incentive and a multitude of gameplay changes to encourage you to pursue that mechanical incentive, Bloodborne puts a lot at stake on playing aggressive, and preys as a result on a concept called dominant strategy. While you could spend entire videos or research papers explaining this subject, all you really need to understand for the purposes of this video is the following. If a player regards strategy A to be the ultimate method, they will utilize strategy A regardless of the merits or options presented by strategy B. If you're given an ultimate method of progression, a win button if you will always use that method because it is what you are used to and it what provides the results that you find satisfactory and fun. Now, what classifies as a win button? Well, from my experience, there's 3 ways to describe such an ultimate method. 1. A method that is significantly more efficient than other methods. This is primarily relating to damage, time, or more likely both. 2. A method that is significantly easier or reliable to execute than other methods. Often not the most efficient, an easy method is, well, easy to use. Straightforward and comfortable for new or cautious players to utilize and get satisfactory results from. It's this method that, in my opinion, is why turtling in your normal Dark Souls game is such an attractive and habit-forming method. Or 3. A method that is significantly more effective than other methods. While not always efficient or easy, an effective method gets the job done reliably and is almost always attractive to players. If you want to see this type of dominant strategy in effect, there are a myriad of Dark Souls One Punch Man build videos on YouTube for you to watch after this video. It's very rare for any of these dominant strategies to be mutually exclusive. An efficient method is almost always effective, but may not be easy. Likewise, an easy method may be effective, but it may not be efficient. On the rare occasions where something is all 3, take for instance Mega Rayquaza from the Pokemon series, it's quite easy to see the effect dominant strategy has on players and their perceptions of it. Ideally, a method is 2 of the 3 E's of dominant strategy, as we'll call them, and more often than not, these will satisfy most players. As mentioned above, the easiest way to approach most Dark Souls games is to cower behind your shield. Stand your ground, and if you have a clear spear, all the better. Unfortunately, this method is not certainly efficient and is only effective in the sense that it disposes of enemies. If you want to get efficient and effective when you play Dark Souls, you have to go more on the offensive. The problem is, by doing so, you toss away the second and arguably most important E of dominant strategy, the ease. People like things to be easy. Being frustrated is not fun. Dark Souls, despite my clamoring for how aggressive playstyles are beneficial, doesn't actually reward it mechanically. Yes, there is a significant skill gap in players, with aggressive players being much better at the game than passive ones. But this is merely bragging rights and translates to the only tangible thing being a shorter playtime. So, how do you make the effective and efficient methods attractive for people? Well, you make a game where that method is good for more than just those bragging rights and shorter playtime. Bloodborne makes the dominant strategy the efficient and effective method by providing mechanical benefit to those who utilize it. It would be idiotic to suggest that Bloodborne changes combat from Dark Souls purely as a result of lack of shields. There are more variables at work here that contribute to completely upending the way players interact with the game and what they perceive as the dominant strategy. Bloodborne is designed in such a way that with its long combos, reactive interactions, and aggressive enemies that match your own aggression, the game can be played efficiently, effectively, and easily through aggressive play as a dominant overarching method, regardless of build, because doing so prevents actual in-game advantage. Simply the best way to get you to do something is to reward you for doing it through gameplay. All this talk about audio cues and parries has got me thinking. I'd like to speak for a moment about Bloodborne's sound design. Everything about this game's sound design is frankly astounding, from the manic dialogue of the mad Yarnamites to the scraping, pulsating noises of the brain of Mensis. It pulls you in and immerses you into Bloodborne's world. Play this game in the dark with a decent speaker system and you will thank me later. Everything feels so deliberate and calculated. Footsteps and weapons hitting the ground have a real weight to them thanks to their sound design. Everything from the echoes created by gunshots to the unearthly screams of the game's bestial enemies makes my skin crawl in the best way possible. Special mention goes to this enemy right here. The sound they make as their axe drags across the ground is just awesome. This is of course barring the damn baby crying. It's subtle, but after the blood moon falls, a baby's crying is added to the game's ambient soundtrack. This is of course the weeping of the newborn god Murgo, a great one kept alive by the cult of Mensis, the last crazed remains of Lawrence's inner circle. The crying gets louder and more noticeable as you ascend Murgo's loft in the Nightmare of Mensis, and is quelled by the lullaby that serves as the boss theme for the Wet Nurse. Curiously, Murgo's burgeoning godhood is not always in the background. Start New Game Plus with 60 insight and you can still hear it, ever so faintly. The music is bar none the best aspect of Bloodborne's soundtrack. Its music has an eerie quality that I've seldom seen matched. It's fully orchestrated and almost always used perfectly in every instance it shows up, not to mention they have a full Gregorian choir to come along with it. The hollow chanting of the Herpergian jail is probably one of the few level themes in the game, and also why it does a damn good job of reminding you of that. The boss themes, though, are really where it kills it, and I promised I wouldn't gush in this video, but Ludwig the Holy Blade is legitimately the best cutscene ever. The laugh, the voice acting, the glimmer of the Moonlight Greatsword, all paired with one of the most spine-tingling build-ups in the whole soundtrack. Frankly, the Old Hunters is worth the price of admission for this one single boss fight alone. I can recite this thing by heart, and I don't think I've skipped it either. It is that damn good.
My true mentor, my guiding moonlight.
I'd be doing this video a disservice by acting like Bloodborne is completely flawless when in fact I'd say it is far from it. While I have plenty of small gripes, like how skill is just objectively the best stat in the game, and there is a general dip in boss quality towards the mid and late game, excluding Ligarius of course, there are a few major flaws in Bloodborne's design that bug me the most of all. Gameplay-wise, much of my issues happen to fall in line with that wonderful dominant strategy thing I spoke so highly of earlier. As much as I praise the parry system in Bloodborne for how it makes parries more reactive, this does not mean they cannot be abused. Bloodborne can in fact be played passively, despite my insistence that the game funnels you into going all-out aggressive. Parry fishing is an extremely viable tactic, and unlike shield turtling, it's not a habit new players develop because they play too passively, but rather a habit that experienced players develop by playing too lazy. I noticed I started to do this around my third or fourth playthrough of the game. I had gotten so confident with the parry system that I made encounters either trivial or needlessly more difficult to myself because I kept fishing for more parries. It took a whole playthrough where I insisted on barely leveling skill in favor of strength and arcane to kick that habit. If I would change one thing about the game, it would be that consecutive parries on bosses get harder to land. If this was the case, fights like Ligarius and Maria wouldn't become trivial if you're a parry god like myself. And considering those are two of my favorite fights in the game, I would not mind getting my ass kicked and getting stuck at them like I did on my first playthrough. Another aspect of the gameplay that bothers me is how aggressive play creates a problem that pervades every single combat encounter in the game: greed. The get one more hit in mentality I previously praised is simultaneously also the biggest shortcoming of Bloodborne's combat system. This is mostly because of Bloodborne's obscenely baffling way it handles the counter mechanic. After every action you do, whether it's an attempt to parry, evade, or attack, should your character be hit during the recovery animation of that action, they will take double damage from the attack that does so. The streamer Otzdarva demonstrated this problem perfectly during his Blood Level 4 run of the game by facing this boss. There is a charge attack that he could just not get the dodge timing down for, and every time he'd attempt to dodge it, he'd take counter damage and get one shot. It got to the point where he resolved that not dodging the attack was in fact better, as he just had just enough HP to tank the attack uncountered.
Why do you always get hit by the charge? I have to get hit by the charge. If I try to dodge it, I simply die. It's impossible to dodge it. There's like, if you're far away, there's like maybe a 10% chance of dodging it. If you don't move, I don't get counter damage, so I can survive it. I have to let it hit me. If I try to dodge it, it will counter damage, and it will kill me straight away.
It shouldn't take a genius to realize that a mechanic meant to punish greed can actually discourage another integral part of the combat system. By making evasion so frame perfect like this, it needlessly discourages players from evading and can waste healing items that would be better spent when they're needed, rather than cleaning up for a partially flubbed dodge. In normal gameplay, where more often than not, by endgame you'll have the HP bar of considerable girth, it does however become a problem on low-level builds and challenge runs, or perhaps a randomly generated dungeon that robs you of half your HP but still has endgame damage values for some reason. Yep. Chalice Dungeons, the ugly wart on top of Bloodborne. These procedurally generated messes are emblematic of everything Bloodborne isn't. They're repetitive, grindy, and reek of lazy design. Bloodborne's level design is comparatively normally built on an entirely vertical axis. You are constantly moving up or down across layers of the world. Levels like the Research Hall, Murgo's Loft, and Canehurst exemplify this at an extreme, but even levels like Central Yharnam, Old Yharnam, and the Forbidden Woods operate on this vertical axis. There are distinct layers to the world that allow it to tie itself into knots through elevators, shortcuts, and the like. The world feels like a 7-layer cake that you are slowly digging into with a long metal rod, each layer a denser bake than the last. It is ingenious and frankly thematic to the lore as you spiral downwards into insanity. There's a sense of careful planning to the aesthetics to guide you to where shortcut might be, and the enemy placement is very deliberate, fair, and levels like Central Yharnam build challenge beautifully in how they introduce you to basic enemies, larger crowds of those enemies, larger single foes, and finally groups of both. This is a delicate balance that even the main game struggles with at times, especially when it attempts to add in level hazards like in the early section of the Nightmare of Mensis. Bloodborne's combat plays well with the challenges that are crafted for it, and level progression feels smooth when the aesthetics are varied and the areas are distinctly designed. Naturally, this delicate balance then falls apart when it becomes left to a random number generator. The Chalice Dungeons are plagued with so many unfair enemy layouts, samey aesthetics, and drab, uninteresting design. There's only so many times I can see the same 20 room layouts recycled and reused, and what makes this even more infuriating is many of the game's most exhilarating boss encounters, as well as 2 trophies, are hidden deep within a slog that can take as long or longer than the base game to complete. The Chalice Dungeons even managed to screw up the vertical axis of the game's level design. Despite having distinct layers themselves, each dungeon in the Chalices isolates those layers completely, forcing a nauseatingly repetitive gameplay pattern. The other primary issue I take with the Chalices relates to earlier in the story segment of this video when I mentioned the distinct lack of a time abyss for most things, apart from the Temerians, the civilization who constructed the Chalice Dungeons. The problem with them lies primarily with the fact that they do create that time abyss I voiced concern about earlier. The Temerians existed long before the rest of Bloodborne. Their lore is patchy at best and incomplete at worst. Most egregiously, it has direct bearing on the events and struggles that are immediately important to the main game. What's frustrating about the direction it expands the events pertaining to Lauren and the Scholars of Mensis in this way is that it devalues their role as the absent antagonists, trying to play God, and instead puts the blame on the curiosity of them instead of their hubris, weakening the game's themes in my opinion. The Chalice Dungeons are where the choir found and captured Ebrietas, therefore the origin of blood healing and thus the game's plot, as well as adding a great deal of context on the infant Great One Murgo. By creating a time abyss in this way, the game's primary stakes, the hope that the hunt will end or things will change, are dashed because Temeru already fell. It takes the immediacy and intimacy away from the problem Yharnam is facing and instead places emphasis on the cyclical end of ages, themes Dark Souls already presented and the rest of Bloodborne shies away from. To be such a blemish on both the level design and the lore makes it very hard for me to justify recommending ever delving into the Chalice Dungeons beyond the opportunities for optimizing your build, which ultimately shouldn't matter if you master the game's mechanics and dominant strategy anyways. In my 8 drafts of this script, I have only gotten this far 4 times, and in each of those 4 times I tried to write a conclusion for this video that accurately summed up and recapped everything I talked about in this incoherent mess of the video, and subsequently couldn't. Hopefully I did illustrate, if only a little, why I love Bloodborne so much. Last summer, I got my Platinum Trophy for the game after finally completing all of the Chalices on my level 140 Moonlight Greatsword build. It was exceedingly tedious, but ultimately worth it. Subsequently, it makes Bloodborne the second game I have ever completed 100%. The ordeal of rewriting the script from the ground up several times and months of delay has put me through the ringer with this video. I even unfortunately had to cut a significant chunk of the video regarding my favorite character, Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, to keep this thing at a manageable length for my own sanity. If you're curious and want to dive deeper into Bloodborne outside of the game itself, then there were 2 resources that really helped me in the creation of this video. The first is the Paleblood Hunt by Redgrave. It's a compilation and analysis of almost all of Bloodborne's lore, organized neatly into categories. It's a great read, and the conclusions Redgrave makes are very interesting and thought-provoking. The other source I'd like to mention is HBomberguy's video, Bloodborne is Genius and Here's Why. I did in fact make a jab at the video during my gameplay segment, mostly because I dislike a lot of conclusions and arguments that HBomberguy presents, but that isn't to say the video isn't worth watching. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Oftentimes, an opinion about something we love that we disagree with wholeheartedly is valuable for making us reevaluate and affirm why we like something to begin with. Watch HBomberguy's video and make the conclusion for yourself. Lastly, I would also like to thank Otzdarva for allowing his footage to be used in the segment regarding counter damage. Check him out on Twitch if you have the time. I will not keep you much longer. If you're interested in playing Bloodborne yourself, it's available new for around $20 nowadays, giving you plenty of spare cash to pick up the old hunters as well. Fair warning, it is PlayStation 4 exclusive, so performance may be an issue on anything other than a PS4 Pro, but trust me when I say Bloodborne and the old hunters is an experience more than worth the price of admission. My name is Zerk, and farewell, good hunters. May you find strength in the waking world.